Okay, so now we're going to move into chapter 26, section 2, all about how the Cold War itself began. And it all starts with the end of World War II and a conference held by the Big Three. And we'll learn about that in just a minute. So, at the end of World War II, most of Europe was in complete ruin because of that concept of total war. It didn't matter if there were civilians around, they kind of became considered collateral damage. So Germany and their allies, and then Britain and their allies were bombing cities. And so most of Europe is laying in ruins. The US, however, emerged from the war stronger than ever. They were like the only country in the world that was involved in the war that was not affected, with the exception of Pearl Harbor. The mainland of the United States was untouched. The Soviet Union, with its huge landmass and abundant resources, was also poised to become a great power. Together, these two superpowers would dominate world affairs. The word superpower is one of your vocabulary words, and basically what a superpower is a really powerful nation. It's one of only a couple in the world. And that's where countries naturally ally to. So you have two superpowers, and the rest of the countries in the world, for the most part, they either allied with the US or they allied with the Soviet Union. So that's what is, and those two countries were superpowers, just really powerful nations who had a lot of influence in the world. So at first, there were hopeful signs that the US and the USSR might actually cooperate in the post-war era. In February of 1945, remember May 8th of 1945 is when World War II ended. So just a couple months before that, as the war was winding down, the Big Three, or the Allied leaders, FDR from the US, Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill from Great Britain, all met in the Soviet Union's city called Yalta. There they made plans for post-war Europe. They agreed to divide Germany, on the next slide here, into 4 Allied occupation zones to be administered by the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And that's the image there on your left. Berlin, the capital city, was actually in the Soviet zone, the red part. You can see a little white circle right here. That's Berlin. And the image here on the right side of your screen, that shows you what happened to Berlin itself. It also was divided into 4 parts among the 4 Allied nations. Stalin also agreed at this Yalta conference to support free and fair elections in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe. At Yalta, the Soviets also agreed to join the United Nations. And the UN was an international body. They officially formed it about a month after the end of World War II, so in June of 1945. 50 nations signed the UN Charter, which officially created a General Assembly of all of those 50 nations, plus 11 of those 50 nations joined the Security Council, which is like another little subgroup of the United Nations, and the goal of that Security Council was to settle disputes. The overall, well, I should say, let's back up for a minute, to settle disputes between other nations, so in the hopes to avoid a World War III. The UN, their purpose was to promote peace, security, and international cooperation. And they pledged to save succeeding generations or upcoming generations from the scourge of war. And so the UN's goal was essentially to promote peace, security, and cooperation among different countries around the world and avoid a World War III, because 60 million people died in World War II, which is like 3 times as many, more than 3 times as many as died in World War I. And so it's just getting worse and worse, and God knows what would happen if we had a World War III. So despite these hopeful signs, deep divisions between the superpowers of the US and Soviet Union made lasting cooperation unlikely. These divisions were based on the two nations' differing histories and different goals for the post-war world. Some of the differences arose from the war itself. During the war, nearly 300,000 American troops lost their lives. But that's nothing, guys, compared to the Soviet Union. There's a big difference between the two. So the U.S. lost 300,000 troops, and there was no fighting that took place on American soil with the exception of the attacks on Pearl Harbor. In contrast, almost 28 million people died, whether they were civilian or soldier, of the Soviet Union. And there was significant amounts of fighting on Soviet soil or Soviet territory. And so nobody in the Soviet Union was untouched by the war, whereas in the U.S. there were people who knew the war was going on, but it really wasn't impacting them super personally. So the two superpowers also had different goals and beliefs. Having been profoundly scarred by the war, the chief aim of the Soviets was to ensure their security because they had been attacked from the West by Germany. They've been really vulnerable to invasion. They wanted to make sure to protect themselves from any future attacks, particularly from this Western border of theirs. So they wanted to create a buffer zone, and you can see that outlined on your screen there. Those countries that are outlined in black, that was what their goal was, to influence those nations and their governments to be their allies, to be their friends, their allies, whatever, so that when they were attacked, they had a little, like by, let's say Germany attacked them again, they'd have a little bit of protection because those other countries would get attacked first. In neighboring countries, the Soviets also wanted to promote regimes sympathetic to communism. So the USSR wanted to spread communism around the world. They set out to reorganize the economy along socialist lines. Under socialism, the government owned all factories. The state seized private land and took charge of agricultural production or turned land over to peasant collectives. So as far as Soviet leaders and what they expected would happen, communism versus capitalism, they were very confident that communism would ultimately defeat capitalism because your average worker or peasant in these various nations were going to follow the Soviet model according to the Soviet Union. But they knew that it would not occur without a struggle. The U.S. was also concerned with security. Pearl Harbor made it pretty clear to the U.S. That they were no longer safe from attack. They needed to defend themselves against threats from abroad. And a key part of this strategy was to prevent hostile powers from taking control of the countries and resources in Eurasia. Okay, Eurasia is a combination of Europe and Asia. I don't know, think of it like combining the names of celebrities to when they're dating or whatever. You can think of it that way. That's what Eurasia is. To accomplish this, the U.S. would need to maintain a strong military presence overseas with military bases and strong allies in Europe and Asia. So, Americans want to promote capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union wants to support or promote communism. Okay, and they're opposites, those ideologies. So I think we can all assume that some tension is going to result from this. Given their differences, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were unlikely to remain allies for very long. Although they both wanted a peaceful, secure world, their contrasting perspectives on how to achieve that objective put them in conflict. So, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union want peace. Nobody wants another war. But they both have different ideas of how to keep that peace and how to achieve that peace. So, the first signs of obvious struggle, or trouble, I should say, appeared in Eastern Europe. Although Stalin had promised to allow Eastern European countries to decide their own fate, he soon withdrew that pledge. In Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, you can see them there on your map. They're all in red. He made sure that pro-Soviet governments took power, so he influenced their elections. He later did the same in the rest of Eastern Europe. The Soviet-dominated countries of Eastern Europe became known as Soviet satellites. And you can see those in the red, or like Yugoslavia and Albania. They are other communist states. Those are all considered, I don't want to say allies of the Soviet Union, but heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. In response, the US and Great Britain accused the Soviets of dividing Europe and stifling national self-determination. In a famous speech in March of 1946, Winston Churchill warned of the Soviet threat, and he said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he declared, "an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The term Iron Curtain, which is one of your vocabulary words, came to symbolize the growing divide between East and West. And it's an ideological barrier. The Iron Curtain is not an actual physical wall or fence or whatever, but oftentimes it is depicted as that in political cartoons or whatever. But it's that ideological barrier that we see, if you follow my mouse on the screen here, between the blue and the red countries. Okay, that's where that Iron Curtain falls. It's the ideological barrier dividing Eastern and Western Europe during the Cold War. From Moscow, Stalin blasted Churchill's speech as a call to war. Meanwhile, the U.S. was devising policies to counter Soviet power. Early in 1946, a U.S. official in Moscow, George Kennan, wrote a tough analysis of Soviet aims. He said that the USSR had imposed tyranny on its people and meant to do so elsewhere. The only effective response, he argued, was for the U.S. to check or contain the spread of Soviet power and influence. This approach became known as containment. This is another one of your vocab words. And it's just the idea of restricting Soviet power, stopping the spread of communism. It is a U.S. policy to stop communism from spreading around the world. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in 1945, remember he's the one that decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, soon acted on this containment policy. In March of 1947, he called for American aid to Greece and Turkey, two countries under threat from communist elements and backed by the USSR. In a speech, Truman declared, "We must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way." This support for countries seeking to resist communist influence was known as the Truman Doctrine, and it became a key principle in U.S. Cold War policy. The U.S. followed up with another action designed to limit Soviet power. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall unveiled a financial aid plan to assist post-war recovery in Europe. This was called the Marshall Plan. Western Europe loved it. But the Soviet Union, they forbade their satellite states that you see in red on your screen from participating, recognizing that if they allowed their satellite states to accept this aid, that it would weaken their influence, Soviet influence, in these red countries that you see on the screen. The Marshall Plan eventually provided $13 billion in aid to Western Europe, helping to promote economic growth and political stability. The Western Allies also announced plans to combine their German occupation zones into a new West German state. Angered by this move, Stalin declared a blockade of the Allied sectors of West Berlin in June of 1948. Berlin was entirely within the Soviet zone, but the city, remember, had been divided into those four sectors. The Berlin blockade cut West Berlin off from all supplies brought in by land. Stalin hoped to starve the city into submission and force the Allies to retract their plans for West Germany. Instead, the U.S. organized something called the Berlin Airlift, a massive effort to fly food and other essential goods into Berlin, because remember, Stalin blocked all those roads into Berlin in that Berlin blockade. So the plan succeeded. So a year later, Stalin lifts the blockade. Soon afterward, Germany splits into two nations. And you can see that right there. You have the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. That's under Western influence. The German Democratic Republic, known as East Germany, became a Soviet satellite. So we should be halfway through the questions for section 2. So we've got a little bit left to cover regarding the Soviet Union's plans and what they achieved.